Everyone, welcome to today's episode of my coding school. Today we're going to go into this next step. We have our Expo application up and running, the very basic. We have this page for hello world, and as you can see, to get started, we added an email and password and sign in. So that means we added a login method, and not just any login method, but login method from Firebase. So we're going to get started with going into Firebase while we're using it and how we can actually integrate it into our basic web application or basic iOS application. So let's go over to Firebase for a little bit. So what is Firebase? Firebase is owned by Google. It's a software as a service or a database as a service that has a lot of different features in it. And because it's Google, it's very well backed. So it was purchased by Google about 5 years ago. Don't quote me on that because I'm probably way off. My perception of time is probably not correct, but it was a startup. It was purchased by Google, and since then they've added a lot of different features to it. One of the big ones that I use for a lot of applications is the authentication methods. It started off as a database as a service, a real-time database, and since then they've added a Firestore, which is more of like a I guess you could say MongoDB JSON structured type database, and then alongside their real-time database for let's say a chat feature. And you can see that on this left-hand bar we have a lot of different Crashlytics performance. They have Google Analytics, obviously storage, hosting, functions. There's a lot here, and there's a pretty good free tier too. So right now, to get started on one of the Spark or Blaze plans, it's just free to get started. The biggest downside of Firebase is if you start to actually grow your user base, the costs add up really quickly. So I think it's a great place to get started and a side project to start learning, to get connected up and running really quick. But any type of real application, I can't say I would recommend it. It's the real-time database part is pretty cool if you have like a chat feature, but the reason it gets expensive is because they'll charge you per transaction. So what that means is every single time someone adds a chat to the whatever chat bot maybe it be, it'll charge you for that. So like it'll start adding, like, I think the free tier might be like 10,000 transactions per week or something. Um, that sounds like a lot, but let's say you have a chat and you're texting with your friends and you're using Firebase as the backend. That'll quickly add up if it's not just you as a user. If you have thousands of users times how many messages they send per day, it starts to add up pretty quickly. So long story short, there's a lot of positives to get started. Negatives comes when long term actually growing your application. But the reason it's so popular is because it is so quick to get up and running. So if you were to go to firebase.com, first you have to sign up using your Google account and then create an actual project. Once you create a project, you'll come to this screen. So I created a test project from my coding school, and that's what we're going to use. So right now has nothing, we're not using anything outside of just getting it up and running to start with. And when you do start the application, it'll configure a bunch of things for you, and then it'll give you a file that looks like this. And so these are you'll want to copy and paste this into a new file. I would call it firebase.js. I just named this one firebase.test.js because Firebase.js has the actual keys in them, but you're going to put your own keys. So right here, I just replaced Firebase key goes here. Once you set everything up, it'll have all the keys for you, so you don't have to go around searching to see where they're at. And in this example, we're using the latest version of Firebase, which is Firebase version 9. And I mention that because the previous one, version 8, they did the transition last year, and they even have Firebase version 7 you can see here. So, and they're all pretty different. So if we go back over here, the upgrade from version 8 to Modular Web SDK, I mentioned in the previous video where Expo had a very bloated application when you got it up and running, and so they started to remove some of the modules into their own NPM modules, so you could add it on later, but it didn't come built into the system. Firebase is kind of doing the same thing where they're trying to unpack some of the modules that come into Firebase, so that you only integrate them as you need them. You don't load them on every single load. So let's say you install Firebase, but you're not using the machine learning or the analytics side of things. In the previous versions, it got bundled in the application, whether you're using them or not. Right now, with the modular version, it only, you can see this right here, removal of unused code. So that was the main purpose of that. It'll only import on build what you're using. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see before we would import Firebase from Firebase/app. And so you would have access to everything within Firebase, which if we come back here is all of this: authentication, app check, Firebase or Firestore database, real-time database, storage, hosting, functions, all of these items. And I haven't even begun to dig into all of these features, so it goes pretty deep. The main ones I use are authentication, Firestore database, analytics, functions, and maybe some storage. Storage gets expensive too, but I haven't really touched anything else. So in this new version, version 9, you're going to import Firebase. Actually, that's not even the right version. Let's come down a little bit more. Here's a good example. So in the modular version, instead of importing all of Firebase, we're going to import the modules that we need. So in this case, we need to use get auth and auth change. So these were going to be the only modules that get imported when you build the application in this new version. Versus here, you're going to import all of the Firebase stuff. So you do firebase.auth. So this means everything is loaded. Everything that Firebase has access to, you have Firebase dot, versus there's no Firebase dot, it's just get auth. So we're just importing this specific thing. And in practice, what that looks like is we have Firebase app and we have Firebase/analytics, and we're just going to do the initialize app and get analytics. Right now, we don't really need these just yet, so you could comment them out, and we're really just going to stick with the initialize app, the actual credentials, and then using those credentials to create the app in our application. So that's the file that we're going to create. But to actually use Firebase, this will give you an error right away. We need to install it. So what we're going to do is, and since we're using npm, you want to do npm I for install Firebase, and that will install our dependency right here, as you can see. So everything else was automatically imported once we built. So Expo status bar, React, and React Native were already here, and we just added our first new one called Firebase. Now keep in mind, if you're using Yarn, you'll have a yarn.lock file, and you want to do yarn add Firebase. But since default's npm, we're going to stick with npm for now. So once we have that installed, we're going to go to our login method. So I just created this file with some very basic functionality right now. So once we have Firebase loaded, we have Firebase installed as an npm module. Now we want to try and actually connect to Firebase with a user. And so before we do that, we're going to our application in Firebase, and we're going to set up authentication first. So in order to get started with any of these modules, we'll have to set it up in Firebase first. And so we have to select it. Right now we don't have any login methods selected. So we have access to all of these: Google, Facebook, email, password, phone, Twitter, GitHub, play games. First, we're going to get started with the very basic one of email and password. And this is all it requires. So if we were to log in or try to log in right now, it just wouldn't work because it's not enabled within our Firebase application just yet. So we just have to go over here, click the button, and click save. And so now we have access to this login OAuth provider of email and password. Now this is very similar to, you could use other login methods. You could use a email password authentication within the application itself. You could set up your own server. Another big service that I use in the past is Auth0. But since we're going to start using Firebase, the other application, so we're going to start using the Firestore hosting functions. It's a great way to have like everything consolidated. As a React Native or front-end developer, you don't want to really have to worry about the backend just yet. So that's why I say Firebase is a great way to get started with the application. If you scale any amount, you kind of want to try and transition over there to a different, your own server, your own database, a SQL database, or even a MongoDB database. But it takes a little bit more time to get up and running. I want to focus on the actual front-end aspect of it, of Expo and React Native. So now that we have our login method enabled, we're going to come back to our application and go through this login file a little bit. So we can see we added this Firebase test. Firebase, I'm not going to click on it, but it's just the initialized app, the actual credentials, and then importing the initialized app. And then in login, we can see, okay, now we're importing this file, Firebase. And I don't want to name it Firebase because there's already a module called Firebase, so I don't want to confuse the system or us. So we're just going to name it Firebase app. You can name it whatever you want, but as long as this file matches what you created, it'll import correctly. And now that we have our file loaded, we have Firebase dependency loaded, we're going to start importing some methods from Firebase/auth. And the main one we're going to use is getAuth and then sign in with email and password, because that's what we're using over here. So there is a lot of differences between version 7, version 8, and version 9 of Firebase. So I do want to iterate that. I want to make sure that if you were to go package JSON, you see Firebase, it has to be Firebase 9, because this lesson is the most up-to-date one so far, and if you're using an older version of Firebase, the syntax might differ a little bit. And so right now we have getAuth, sign in with email and password. And we have we're going to create some very basic fields. We have this text input that we're importing from React Native, some text, a view, and touchable opacity for a button itself. So we're going to create this text input, we're going to name it, have a placeholder of email address, and so when we add text into here, it's going to update the state, and that's where we have the useState method. So we're going to use hooks for here, and so we're going to define the actual variable as email, and the function that updates it, update email, and so that gets called anytime any text changes in this field. It calls update email, and it sets the value to email. So we're going to do the same thing for password, update password, and if you see, we're going to try T Martin, and we're going to do tim@mycodingschool.com, and we're just going to do a very basic password, and you can see this secure text entry just shows it as any password field like you would in a web. We also add this touchable opacity, not super necessary for right now, but we'll start to style that in the future, and this onPress event. So onPress, it calls the sign in method that we created. So in this method, we're going to call the sign in with email and password. And there's a few things that we have to do here. Technically, you could just call sign in with email and password directly in this onPress event, but we want to put it in a try catch block, so if something happens, we get the error message and we can fix it from the front end. But in order to use the sign in with email and password, we do have to make sure we have this getAuth method. So like I said, Firebase is initialized, but then we have to grab the authentication module out of Firebase once it's initialized. So the way we do that is with this getAuth method. So just think of it as it's getting it from the Firebase module. It had giving you access to this auth variable. This can name whatever you want. but this has to be imported from Firebase auth and pass in whatever you named up here for Firebase app initialization. And in order to use sign with email and password, we're going to pass in, and it has to be in this order. The first item is the authentication, so the initialized app authentication, and then we're going to pass in the email that we have from state and the password that we have from state. So right now that would be tim@mycodingschool.com and the password. And then once we try to sign in with that person, we're just going to console log that user to see what it looks like. And so we're going to go over some error message that I had before. So right now we have tim@mycodingschool.com, password, and we're going to try and click sign in to see what happens. So we have Firebase error. So good error. We can at least know that we're connected to Firebase and the auth user was not found. And that is because I put sign in instead of create. So what we're going to do is do the create, and I'm going to go back over to the application that I initially created as an example, and we're supposed to do sign up, and then we do sign in create user with email and password. So let's update that real quick and try again. So there we go. We can see in the console we have a lot of stuff going on here. The main part is the access token and the user ID at the end here. So you can see this user ID was created when we started to do create user with email and password. And if we come over here and click users, we can see tim@mycodingschool.com that user is successfully created. I got a little ahead of myself over here because let's say we did want to make this a sign in. We could, now that the user is created, it will sign in correctly. So let's try sign in again, and we get the same response. So now technically this user has been signed in. We haven't done anything with that user yet. We've just logged it, but we've successfully installed Firebase into our Expo application. We've set up authentication with email and password, and we're able to successfully create a user and sign in with that user with Firebase. So that was a lot in one lesson. Probably should have been 2 videos, but hopefully that was helpful. And in the next video, we're going to keep on adding onto this application that eventually we'll come back to this one that I just showed of my own personal TrackFi application that has a lot of different, has Apple login, has Google login, has face authentication, has email, password, and it's a finance tracking app, so it has a lot of different APIs we're connected to that I'll go over in this course as well. See you next time, and have a great one. Peace.